We were talking a little bit about kind of the first couple of centuries of what's going on this side of the Atlantic in terms of the development of civilization, and in particular, kind of tracing the arc of things like what do people do for fun, and what's that probably going to mean for us in the near future with respect to being park rangers, foresters, folks kind of interfacing humans with natural landscapes of all stripes, not just forested. So, we got as far as, last Thursday we finished talking in kind of the early to mid 1800s. We were talking about kind of if you want to think of sort of the history of what is now the United States as a bunch of phases. We had a colonial phase, a 13 colonies phase kind of thing, and now we're into kind of the next generation of folks in the early to mid 1800s, kind of the next generation of people coming up after George Washington, Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and so on and so forth. Slavery or human enslavement is a big time economic thing in southern states, and some people aren't real happy with that. Other folks are perfectly content, apparently, to let that roll. So, the United States is absolutely in its early sort of growing pains as a country. We're kind of inventing representative democracy in a modern society sense, kind of from whole cloth. Like, we won the Revolutionary War and nobody really expected us to do that, and so, we got to send a middle finger back to King George with his defeated armies, the Cornwallis and all of them. We all saw, what was it, The Patriot with Mel Gibson before he went all weird and anti-Semitic. So it's a lot. There is no National Park Service yet. There's no Forest Service yet. We don't have national forests. We don't have national parks. None of that's at all even a thing. We don't even have the coasts connected in 1800. We're not going to get railroad connection between the two coasts, which is the first high speed, high throughput, high volume, moving lots of stuff thing back and forth, kind of in history, right? So in the mid 1800s, we're seeing the effects, the outcomes, the outworkings of technology, like steam power. And technology is sort of potentiating each other and kind of speeding up over time, and that has continued through today, of course, with stuff like AI. Generative AI lately is all over the news. So, we have things like the steam engine, which is pretty obviously good at moving tractors. If you've ever seen a steam tractor, moving locomotives, pulling lots and lots of tons of material and people from battlefield to battlefield in the Civil War, mostly for the North, and also kind of taming that Wild West. And that's interesting and good, but it is something that is not necessarily the same story experienced by all sides. So we have this acquisition and disposal phase with things like the Louisiana Purchase, Texas coming in sort of whole hog as a big chunk of real estate. A little bit later, right after the Civil War, we talked about how Alaska got bought for a couple of pennies per acre kind of thing. And it was millions and millions and millions of acres that nobody really thought much about. It was just the Alaska Territory bought from Russia. So this is a lot happening real fast. The pace of change here is pretty bonkers. And then we have the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. And that threatens to sort of shatter this fragile federation of mostly independent states. And the federal level of government kind of unites all of these states after the Civil War and grows in power quite a bit. So we move from kind of a vibe of, I'm a resident and kind of low-key citizen of Vermont or Illinois Territory or something like that, to I'm a United States of American kind of vibe. But that doesn't happen until after 1865, right? And it doesn't happen all at once. It's a slow change in the allocation of who runs America. Is it a bunch of states? Is it a bunch of individual pioneers and settlers out in big territories out west, kind of running themselves? Religious refugee groups like the Mormons, some of them split off to Michigan and got wrecked when they tried to mint their own money by the IRS. Do not mess with the IRS. They are the Pinkerton Guards of the federal government, and they will wreck your face. Same thing with the Postal Service. They have their own police, and you don't mess with federal agents. Anyway, the rest of the Mormons go over to Utah and all of this, and everybody's trying to sort of navigate how do we do this thing in the absence of a monarchy system that has been kind of the default for everybody else all over the recognizable world, Western Europe for most of these people. It's worked like that for like a millennium or more. So this is pretty different. We're gonna crack some eggs as we make the omelet of America. Okay? And we have this whole, you've heard the whole melting pot metaphor, right? People coming in from Southeast Asia, right? So Chinese immigrant laborers helped build the railroads and connect up the coasts. In waves of immigration, we had Irish, German, Scots and Irish, English folks, French, Spanish, like throughout this time, people are just arriving to America at full speed. And at the same time, we have, unfortunately, a lot of folks who are already here kind of getting pushed aside. So this is ironic as a statement. This is a joke, right? So this was kind of the prevailing attitude. We have this sense of manifest destiny put out by Caucasian thinkers in the United States. And the sense is, well, God is clearly on our side if we're able to win the Revolutionary War and later the Civil War to kind of hold it all together. Maybe this is a mandate for us to sort of take over all of this land and low-key conquer everything and sort of push some people out of the way along the way. So that's tough. But all of this is sort of happening at this time. So George Armstrong Custer, redhead, awesome, hardcore, no-shave November mustache game. Like, this is the era in the middle of the 1800s when his entire unit's going to get wiped out at the Battle of, anybody know? Little Bighorn, very good. So, year on year, there are meaningful changes in the map of what is the United States in a way that we don't really have anymore. Like, we're pretty well crystallized in terms of what is the United States. Even our protectorates are pretty well, places like Puerto Rico, for example. Those are pretty established now. Everybody sort of understands where everybody stands, whether or not we're all happy with it. But in this time, there's a lot of churn. There's a lot of change. There's a lot of growth and a lot of growing pains with that growth. One thing that the federal government does to try and turn all those land acquisitions, paying a whole bunch of money to foreign governments, so wealth leaving the United States, one thing that the American federal government does is give away that land, not just to folks like the Sooners and the Hoosiers we were talking about on Thursday, but also folks like railroad tycoons. That's right, it's not just a video game. So, at this time, we have the federal government giving absolutely stupefying amounts of land, basically for free, to the railroad, saying, if you guys bear the cost and the risk of building a whole bunch of rail lines and protecting them from disgruntled First Nations folks who are trying to, make themselves known and felt on the land, and so forth, we'll give you all the land you need to do that for free. So, we'll take care of all of the bureaucracy of, running a rail line from San Francisco to Washington, D.C., pretty great economic thing once you get it done, pretty expensive to do. You gotta dynamite your way through a whole bunch of mountain ranges in the way. And you gotta deal with a whole bunch of different states and territories, all of those miniature bureaucracies along the way. So it's in this time that the federal government starts to really exert more functional control over stuff like anything that crosses a state or territory boundary, like a river. That's going to be managed by the federal government, period. The states don't get that. And that's done to make sure that there can be some continuity, that you don't have to pay or use a different road system, for example. Imagine if the stop signs in Illinois were red octagons with capital STOP on there. And in Missouri, they were bright pink heart-shaped signs that said, slow down, right? The federal approach is to standardize things and remove barriers like inconsistent approaches to things across the states, with things like interstate commerce, flowing waters, and so on. So this is a big deal, and the way the government decided to handle interstate flowing waters is causing insane problems right now. We've got like a tenth of the American population, about 40 million people, over a tenth, basically running out of water real hard, like running out as hard as they can. And that's a function of the federal government taking over things like water rights and establishing the legal precedent on how things like river water along the Colorado Basin is going to be taken and canaled or pumped from Colorado to California, right? I mean, imagine if, like, people in Louisiana were like, we're going to take all of your Mississippi water, Illinois, and if you want to do some farming, that's nice, but, you know, we have first claim on it. That's how water works out west. It's pretty wild stuff. Anyway, so we get these railroad concessions. The federal government says, all right, we'll give you this long, continuous ribbon of land to connect the two coasts, and we've got some places that, as of about 1872, that are pretty cool. They could be tourist destinations. If you guys wanted to, like, send a train up a spur line off of that intercoastal line and have wealthy tourists paying you a bunch of money to, like, stay at your railroad branded lodge. Okay. Part of the railroad concessions were to spur lines and stations at what would become national parks and forests a little bit later on. That's a pretty big deal. We'll see that showing up later. So, at this time, the government's giving away land like water, but they are also hearing from people like John Wesley Powell, who is kind of the Bear Grylls of his time, but just less sort of personal brand minded. He was like a very conscientious and adventuresome person. We would absolutely claim him as a forest hydrologist these days. Super crazy guy. Not crazy, but daring. So he was the person who led an expedition to float the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon just to see where it went and to kind of map and catalog an inventory as sent out by the federal government to come back to Washington and write a report and be like, all right, so I just wandered through Arizona and Utah, the two states that border the Grand Canyon for the most part, and here's what I found. Because they had no idea, right? They had bought all of these millions and millions and millions of acres from all these other countries, but nobody had really systematically explored or really mapped consistently any of it. So the United States Geological Survey is going to get set up around this time and is going to be partially supported and organized along the lines of Abraham Lincoln's federal government realizing in wartime, we don't even know where we're fighting. Like, we don't have good maps. Maps at this time are all hand-drawn. They're all done kind of one by one, and if you've ever been to like the visitor center or Land Between the Lakes, where they have some late 1700s maps of the area, you can kind of, if you stand on the other side of the room and squint, you can kind of see recognizable things like, the riverine borders of Illinois and stuff like that. And then you can also see huge, like, state-sized chunks of land where they had no fucking clue what to write on the map. And so they just sort of like, well, there's probably a river through here, and it has no basis in reality. That was the best map that, like, the federal government could put together in the late 1800s, right? Because the federal government's like 3 years old in 1790, So, this is a difficult time for land management because our ignorance is a lot bigger than our stock of high quality knowledge. So we get things like the Lewis and Clark expedition. You guys heard of them?
Yep.
All right, there is now a National Historic Trail that commemorates their route. It's a long trail, and it's nuts. That is a wild expedition, y'all. Like, they just started walking and riding, and we're like, well, hopefully we all survive to the other end. I mean, can you imagine, like, you sign on with the Forest Service, and they're like, we're gonna send you out there with an air rifle. They used air rifles because they were quieter than black powder guns for hunting, and they didn't know who they were gonna piss off on this trip, so they figured, we'll go stealth mode with air guns. I mean, anyway, they were similar to break barrel style ones, if you're familiar with those. Anyway, so the Lewis and Clark expedition and John Wesley Powell with the United States Geological Survey, or what would become the USGS, they're doing things like these expeditions to figure out what we've even bought. Can you imagine buying a car and then being like, okay, well, we paid for this, we've got it home now, let's see if there's an engine in it, Like, that's kind of how we're running the country at this time, because people move slow, and information is expensive and very dangerous to gather. One of the guys on the Lewis and Clark expedition got separated from the group around the Yellowstone Caldera area, and got thrown off his horse, lost his glasses. He was like severely myopic, couldn't see like his hand at arm's length, and he broke his leg, and he had to crawl for a couple of weeks through a national park that is not a national park yet to get to some settlers. Like, this guy was basically the Revenant, except, not Leonardo DiCaprio chasing 15-year-old girls or whatever he's into. So this was a pretty chaotic time, and pretty much the leisure that we get out of this time, according to records, is pretty civilized stuff. Going to the Playhouse and watching human actors on stage. We've got these parks and pleasuring grounds, which sounds a little bit weird today, but that was like a place where you could go play frisbee or fly a kite. That was their term for basically open park spaces in the 1800s. And so while the federal government is sending out these expeditions, immediately they start hearing back from these expeditions, back from John Wesley Powell, hey guys, you have no idea how big the Grand Canyon is. Also, this is not great for farming, so I know you guys sent me out here to find a bunch of farmland and figure out how to sort of locate that farmland along rivers. Yeah, there's not really enough moisture for that, so if you want to do anything with the whole ass Southwest, you're going to need to set up a system, a federally managed system of canals and irrigation systems, and later on pumped wells for fossil water. So this is all sort of coming to bear in the mid-1800s. And as Congress gets back these reports from the Lewis and Clark expedition, which was successful, a couple of people died, but, their sacrifice is a price that we are willing to pay, And Congress is thinking, okay, what do we do with these reports? Because there's ample farmland in like the Midwestern states, the prairie states, and for some of it, it sounds pretty borderline. Okay, we can probably still do like animal agriculture, ranching on that stuff. Borderline dry grassland areas. And then some of it's not even useful for that. So there's this really cool story out of the Lewis and Clark expedition. By the time they get to northwestern Wyoming, they're all sitting around the campfire at Yellowstone, or what will be called Yellowstone. And geysers are going off, the mud pots are boiling, and all of this stuff. And they're sitting around the campfire, and this is a legend, but this is an oft-repeated one, so maybe there's an ounce of truth in it. They're sitting around the campfire, and they're saying, man, if we send in this report that we are making for this expedition back to Congress, if we send back and tell them that Yellowstone is farmable or ranchable, and technically it kind of is if you don't really care much about getting much productivity out of it. It's a high plateau, it's very cold, long winters. You can get snowdrifts there to this day in June, 6-foot snowdrifts. Ask me how I know. They say, okay, so why don't we just kind of pitch this area right here, however big this area is, this weird plateau with all this volcanic stuff. Why don't we just tell Congress that this place sucks? It's not useful for anything. It's not productive for farmland. It's not even good for ranching. Congress, if you just want to throw people a bone in this area, maybe we're gonna have some unhappy people if they try to farm it. So let's set it aside for something else. It's unproductive land. So they really characterize one of the most beautiful and interesting and diverse places in the world as worthless land. I mean, that takes some sand to write that in your letter to Congress. Be like, yeah, just this area over here is rounding error. Just drop it off.
Nothing to see here.
Right, nothing to see here. And so Congress was like, I don't believe you, but I don't know any better, so we'll go ahead and set that aside as a park. And since we're the federal Congress, I guess it'll be a federal park. This is in 1872, shortly after the conclusion of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And there's a whole bunch of big forests out west. We can basically mine out or log out for timber. We found a whole bunch of places where mining operations are going to be hugely successful. But this and a couple other spots, like this Yellowstone place, it's just kind of worthless. And so Congress is like, okay, we'll take the worthless thing, we'll slap a park label on it, and people will want to spend money there. It'll be cool. So we have our first national park in 1872 by an act of Congress. That fall, Congress hires this guy, Harry Yount. And Harry Yount looks like his name sounds. He's got an awesome beard and a big wide-brimmed hat. He's a game warden. First National Park Ranger. And so Harry Yount gets hired by Congress for some, I don't know, $150 a month, whatever they paid back in the mid-1800s, to go essentially be the game warden for Yellowstone, which is a big place if you've ever been there. It's huge. And there are no roads, there are no towns, there's nothing there from a Western European sort of civilization mindset. There's a whole bunch of indigenous peoples, right? And it's a sacred place for some of them. It's an amazing place, but there's not a lot of infrastructure. So, Harry Yount arrives that autumn and sort of marches around chasing a couple of poachers, basically people overhunting without permits in that area. And there were settlers nearby, which is where the poaching pressure came from. And winter in Yellowstone is hard.
Yeah.
Winter in Yellowstone is very hard. Winter in Yellowstone is so hard that if you're a bison in Yellowstone and you get fenced in to that high plateau, it's reasonably likely that you're going to freeze to death just that year. right? Imagine having to live your entire life, year after year, winter after winter up there. So, Harry Yount has a bad time. And he writes a letter to Congress, and it's awesome. He was like, consider this my resignation. I've been working here for 7-8 months, whatever. This is bullshit. Like, this is ridiculous. You don't need a conservation police officer, basically, like he was. You don't need a game warden. You need an entire army of people to do this. There's no roads, there's no nothing. A couple of tourists are thinking about showing up to this place, and they're arriving, and there's, like, it's just him and his backpack and his pack horse, you know? Like, what is he gonna do with tourists trying to see this beautiful new national park? So he quits. He just nopes out of there and walks off into the sunset. And Congress is like, okay, noted. And they don't create a National Park Service. For 40 years. 2 entire generations of people are born and grow up before Harry Yount's suggestion that the Park Service be a thing to manage national parks. In the meantime, Congress kind of leaned into what they had access to and who had any training in that area, and that was mostly the United States cavalry. So in places like the Presidio, a military installation in the Bay Area in California, there's some really cool accounts of post-Civil War soldiers marching and riding out to what is going to be one of the next early national parks, Yosemite National Park. We'll talk about that formation here in a bit. And all these soldiers are riding out, and they are, at this time, the officers are trained to be highly self-sufficient in the field. So think about it. If you're a United States cavalry officer in the United States Army at this time, you don't have GPS. You don't have the Eisenhower interstate system for another 100 years. You don't have cars. You have your horses, the stuff that those horses can carry, and you. So, cavalry officers were trained to be Renaissance people in the real sense of it. They had to be bridge engineers, able to get their forces across water courses, maybe even under fire. They had to be skilled, highly skilled navigators, using manual instrumentation to do so. And when it's real cloudy out, okay, you've got your compass, and that's about it, right? They were skilled naturalists because they had to, at times, supplement their provisions, their food supplies, with things that they hunted or gathered in the field. They had to understand, we would call it like civil engineering and water engineering, stuff like that. So when they established a camp, they were trained to, believe it or not, hot take, dig their latrine trenches downstream of where they get the drinking water. Okay? You know, people objected to having to drink feces. For some reason, people are so special these days. So the cavalry seemed like a good fit. And the cavalry started running the national parks like the cavalry is inclined to do, right? It was a pretty good gig. Imagine signing up to pay for college or whatever, before they had the Montgomery GI Bill, but you get the idea. Imagine signing up and then you go get to work in a national park instead of shooting at people, shooting at you, and so forth. Not a bad gig. But it was a military approach to doing things, and that wasn't necessarily compatible automatically with folks, rich folks, who might be entitled, showing up to these new parks. Before there are any roads to these places, you're either getting into it by stagecoach, like a couple of days in a bouncy stagecoach on a not paved road to get out to Yellowstone in the middle of nowhere. Or like a train ride for several days to do much the same thing along those railroad corridors. So this is, we have these very wealthy tourists, not everybody can afford to get to these parks, showing up and, cabaret waking up at dawn, 4:30 in the morning in high latitude, and playing the bugle, like waking everybody up kind of thing. And it's like, I thought we were at a national park. Do I have to do calisthenics now? Do I salute? What do I do with my hands? So the cavalry was good at the land management, not so great at the people management side of it. And we kind of had to learn as a country that, we have to manage this land. This is the absolutely, as hard as we can, full send level resource extraction for the entire country at this point, right? Once we get everything hooked up with railroad, we're getting all those board feet of timber out of the Pacific Northwest, out of the forests of the Southeast, out of places like upstate New York, and getting those to cities and building out places like Chicago and St. Louis. And San Francisco is a lot of board feet of timber. Big city, even back then. And then San Francisco burns to the ground because the whole place is wood. And San Francisco is right on the bay. So the entire city was basically destroyed right next to a pretty ample water source. We'd call it the Pacific Ocean. Maybe you've heard of it. So yeah, it's a country that is still absolutely trying to figure out, how do we take advantage of these natural resources? How do we convert that to wealth? How do we convert that to ease of living? How do we deal with the areas that are worthless? Do we send the military in? Do we send the tourists downrange? And so forth. So Congress, on a very sort of scattershot, one-off basis, they're saying, okay, yeah, we got some weird, big-looking trees, and giant sequoia. By 1890, most of the giant sequoia are logged out off of their 30-foot diameter stumps that are too big for two-person saws. So we'll strap a stick of dynamite to this 30-foot diameter tree. It might be 200-300 feet tall. A lot of cubic feet of timber in there, a lot of planks, and very rot-resistant planks, incidentally, and sort of destroy the thing. And when it falls, it's going to be so much mass and such brittle wood that it's not going to fall as a big 16-foot section. It's going to hit the ground and shatter. Right, so we're not going to get nearly the board feet out of giant sequoia that we were kind of hoping we would on paper. So by 1890, the sequoia are almost completely gone, and so Congress sets aside Sequoia and what will become Sequoia Kings Canyon as a national park in recognizance right around the moment when carrier pigeons passenger pigeons are getting extincted. American bison are real close to extinction by 1890. A lot of stuff these trends are coming to fruition all together around 1890. Wide-scale environmental, not just exploitation, but destruction. And people now, by 1890, are seeing, okay, when we log this stuff, that's a one-time thing. We're never going to get those kinds of forests back. Not at any time scale that is meaningful to running a country. So we get the Forest Reserve Act to start creating the prototypical Forest Service the following year. Okay? So there's a lot happening at this time. It's a lot. And a few people up to this point are trying to sound the alarm. So this guy, George Perkins Marsh, G.P. Marsh, up in Vermont, a scientist and writer, kind of kind of an early forestry guy. Right? This is a couple generations before Gifford Pinchot is gonna land on the scene, roundhouse kicking, and with that, as the youth say, riz. Alright, so in 1864, Civil War is still going. George Perkins Marsh is living up in Vermont in a cabin, basically, that's in one little steep-walled valley that's forested called a cove. And he notices there are a couple of these coves kind of parallel to each other. So there's a big ridge line, and then there are side ridge lines dividing that ridge's forest up into these little coves. Each one's its own sort of mini watershed. And then the watercourses join in the stream in the larger valley down below. And he notices that, geez, when the local timber company comes in and they log the bejesus out of this cove, but not this one, they get the board feet of timber and they go on and make their money and build some houses and stuff. But the cove doesn't come back as a forest. A, they're not really doing seed plantings behind. They're just sort of extracting the timber and moving on. But B, he realizes, wait a minute, this logged cove, this clear-cut cove, can't come back because all the soil's gone now too. Remove the trees, remove the root stabilization and the organic ground cover, O1 horizon for those of you who've taken soils, and everything erodes down into the creek. And everything in the creek therefore dies. We call that scour or blowout. When sediment either scrapes all the benthic macroinvertebrate habitat that your delicious trout love to eat, or fills it in, right? Scour or blowout. And that's super bad. So he writes this book, Of Man and Nature, which is really one of the first ecology books. It's not a textbook, it's just saying, hey guys, I noticed this thing that, you know, the prevailing religious view is that God created the earth as a garden for humans, and we are commanded to go forth and subdue it in some translations. But when we act like that, we don't get anything out of it beyond a certain point. And this is going to be a real problem. So his book comes out in '64, and not long after that, a bunch of logging in upstate New York along the Hudson River sort of greater watershed, clear-cut logging all throughout upstate New York, which is a pretty big state, causes that same forest loss, soil loss, water quality loss, freshwater habitat loss. And what's downstream of, or down watershed from upstate New York? New York City. New York City is already one of the largest cities in the world and very densely populated. So when people in New York City can no longer drink the water it's that destroyed by logging up to a couple of 100 miles away, a whole lot of people all at once lose the ability to survive. That's pretty bad. And so George Perkins Marsh's book is kind of the right message at the right moment that helped people sit up and go, wow, we can really go too hard on this. Instead of full sending our resource extraction, we can harm ourselves, not just these ecosystems, but like we're starting to get this primitive or early sense of ecosystem services. That was not a concept before the late 1800s, okay? Also around this time, as Yellowstone is getting established on the map as a big square, regardless of its ecological footprint, this guy, Charles Darwin, writes a pretty controversial book at the time called The Origin of Species. I have an 1872 6th edition copy of it if you'd like to see that in my office. It's really cool. And if you know anything about Charles Darwin, he agonized over this book and eventually published it because a competing researcher was basically going to publish a similar theory, but Charles Darwin was like, no, you're stupid and wrong. I'm going to publish this faster and better, and I'll be right, and nobody will remember you. So, he was very aware that this might irk some people with a worldview of a young Earth, so to speak. Earth is between 4,000 and 8,000 years old, depending on how you do the math in the Old Testament. And that ended up proving true, but this theory of evolution ended up explaining a whole bunch of field observations all over the world and got some legs. So, we have the scientific revolution from the 1700s. Now we're seeing some effects out of that. The political revolutions of the 1700s, now we're seeing some effects out of that, right? The United States is now having to figure this stuff out on its own instead of some monarch saying, okay, get into a steady state situation and everybody live on your farm and make me food, right? Basically sort of the Magna Carta era version of get back in the kitchen and make me a sandwich, all of you serfs. Okay, so 1880s, we have some of the first landscape intensive sports and pastimes showing up as well. This is over in Scotland, but it's going to jump to the United States fairly quickly. There's not a lot of flat space in Scotland for golf. In the United States, we've got some space for golf, and so we sort of take that and make it ours. So all of this is kind of winding down this land acquisition, this land disposal, this land assessment kind of thing is winding down by about 1890 when the frontier is declared closed by demographers, people who study lots of people at a time, and geographers, people who study lots of space at a time. And that's going to be a sharp shift of how people think about the endless expanse of the United States. It's not endless, it's finite, and the resources it produces are finite. And that is a major worldview shift of people at the time. Some folks still kind of feel that way. Some folks still live as though our energy production is infinite and so forth. Getting those 4090 graphics cards and burning fossil fuels to play games. Like, we have to power it somehow, okay? So, this part of the United States, the big grasslands are now getting turned into really huge farms. Industrial farming is now about to explode. Now we'll need World War II and World War I and some conversion of military, in particular chemical weapon, chemistry discoveries to be turned into things like how do we make fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers very cheaply. But now we've got the land surveyed and settled and connected up with railroads so that food spoilage isn't a prohibitive problem. And it's about to go into orbit in terms of production, okay? So, at the end of the 1800s, we have guys like Roosevelt. This is not the Great Depression Roosevelt, this is the other one. The one who had a military unit named the Rough Riders. That's right, it's not a condom brand only. It was originally a military unit. Roosevelt's Rough Riders. All around the American West, all around the American Southwest. At that time, the narrative would have been something like securing our borders to the south, that sort of a thing. And Roosevelt, as a sort of very expansive outdoorsman, he eventually gets elected president right after our frontier has closed, right as these clear-cut impacts are happening on our wildlands and causing people in cities to run out of drinking water, which we need a lot of all the time, and so on and so forth. So this Roosevelt guy is going to be pretty important. And he's going to basically be the stage for the epic rap battle of John Muir versus Gifford Pinchot over Hetch Hetchy Valley. So that's going to be the story of Yosemite, starting in the late 1800s and into the first couple of years of the 1900s. We'll tip over in Roosevelt's term in office. Okay? So just to help us, and we'll end here before we get to Niagara Falls, just to help us understand what it meant for America to have Roosevelt as a president. Roosevelt was on the campaign trail at one point, and one of his political detractors, somebody who didn't agree with him, shot him while he was making a speech, like a campaign speech kind of thing. And the guy finished the speech. He's like, I've heard worse, nothing but a flesh wound. And he kept talking. Like, that's metal as fuck, right? I mean that in the most Christian sense. Okay. Let's end right there, about a minute early. If you have any questions, let me know. See you, not Thursday. I'm going to cancel class for Thursday. Be safe for Thanksgiving. And we'll see you afterwards as we wrap up our semester for exams. Sound good?
Yeah.
All right. Cool. Travel safely. Have fun with your families. Celebrate a sense of authentic gratitude for the things that you enjoy. Be close with everything and everyone that you hold near and dear. Have a great break.
So class is canceled on Thursday.
Class is canceled on Thursday for this class, not your other classes. I don't know.
You do that? Well,
I wish.
I really only had like one lab on Thursday. That's it. So.
Okay, cool. Very cool.